Welcome to Generation Citizen's 5th Annual Impact Update webinar. And thank you so much for joining us today. We are cognizant of time and want to be respectful, so we're actually going to get started. Feel free to direct your attention to the Generation Citizen website or at the bit.ly link provided at the bottom of this screen if you'd like to check out our full Impact Progress Report, which we'll be discussing highlights from on this call today. In the next hour, after some brief introductions, we'll be sharing an overview of the organization and our evaluation tools and systems. We'll be sharing highlights from the past year of programming, handing it over to a researcher to share her research on Generation Citizen projects and focus issues from the past 11 semesters, and then finally wrapping up with some conclusions and next steps. Unlike in past years where we've saved a question and answer portion for the end, we'd like to try to incorporate discussion throughout the webinar this afternoon. So if at any point you have a question or comment, feel free to type it into the chat box, which we'll either address in real time or circle back to at the end of several of the sections. So we wanted to break the ice by testing out an introductory question here in the chat box. What impact do you hope high-quality civic learning has on our young people, our schools, our communities, or our democracy? This question can help us ensure that we raise up corroborating evidence within this conversation and could also help inform our future impact evaluation priorities. So we would love to hear your thoughts. As you're simmering on that, let me take a second to introduce myself and the other facilitators who will be joining the call. My name's Sarah Andes, and I'm Generation Citizen Senior Director of Programming. Also in the conversation today, we'll be joined by our co-founder and CEO, Scott, a representative from our Student Leadership Board, and a student from our programming in Oklahoma City, Hannah, a former Generation Citizen teacher and current GC Regional Program Manager, Megan, and a graduate alumnus from the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley, Elena. I'd like to take a minute while we're here to also thank those whose efforts have contributed to this briefing behind the scenes, especially the Program Committee on our National Board of Directors for their constant guidance and support, our partners for letting us into their classrooms to engage in this work with them and with their students, our program team for pounding the pavement to make our program and its evaluation happen, and to Yasmin Makhtavi, our Measurement and Evaluation Associate for the past 2 years, whose relentless organization and analysis brings us here today. So let's move beyond these introductions to individuals and offer an introduction to our organization and to those who are new to it. And for that, I'd love to introduce our co-founder and CEO, Scott.
Thanks, Sarah. Excited to be here. And we are really going to try to use the chat function here. So I think I probably have the only thing that that has responded, which is what type of impact do we want our young people to, what impact do we hope that high quality civics learning has on our young people, schools, communities, or democracy? So hopefully we'll have time for questions, but really anytime you have a thought, anytime you have a question, feel free to use the chat function as it pertains to what we're talking about, or just even if you have a thought on anything going on generally. And so it can be more interactive. I've seen this work really well before. And so hopefully we can use that throughout. So just really briefly, for those of you that don't know Generation Citizen as well, our mission is to work to ensure that every young person in this country receives an effective action civics education, providing them with the knowledge and skills necessary to participate in our democracy as active citizens. Ultimately, we envision a country of young people working together as active and engaged citizens to collectively strengthen our American democracy. But what exactly does action civics mean? So we'll start to talk through a framework of that and get a real story from a young person as well. So this is what we often use in Generation Citizen as our framework for change. We call it the Advocacy Hourglass. Most students still know what an hourglass is. We all, from a time of yonder, know it from games like Yahtzee. But it starts very broad gets more specific, and then goes broader again. And so what happens is that students actually figure out what the issue that they want to tackle is, try to get at the root cause of why that actually exists, figure out a very specific goal, and then take more broader targets and tactics to actually get there. I think one of the reasons this is so important is that oftentimes in American political life, I think we tend to find ourselves at the pole of this triangle, taking broad action on broad issues. We care about climate change, so we go to a rally. We care about something going on in Congress, so we make phone calls. It's not to say that that's not important, but we really want our students to live vibrant political lives, which means actually getting at the root cause of why these issues occur, especially at the local level. And so to actually talk much more compellingly than I can about the hourglass, I'm going to introduce Oklahoma student alumnus Hannah Bigme and student leadership board member, who's going to talk about her own experience of how this actually occurred.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah. I'm from Norman, Oklahoma, and I participated in Generation Citizen during my senior year of high school, and I'm now at OU pursuing a degree in political science. In my class, we did a project on sexual education in public schools. We were concerned about what was happening both statewide and in our own schools, and in order to learn more about this, our project, we reached out to parents and the school board. And we actually had a focus group with the parents, and then we had the school board visit our classroom and talk with our class. So we really felt that we could change sexual education in our state, because there is actually a mandate that requires that all schools in Oklahoma teach abstinence-only sexual education, and that was really what we were focusing on trying to change. But some of the other things we had kind of talked about doing our project on were things like gun control, high teen pregnancy rates, and prison reform. Those were all kind of issues that we saw within our own state. But really, I think the biggest impact that I could see from participating in this program, at least for me, was that it really made me feel inspired to get involved in politics. I actually ended up, after having participated in Generation Citizen, I became an intern for a local campaign here in Oklahoma. And that was really empowering for me, because Generation Citizen kind of gave me the perspective to be able to look at an issue and figure out how to change that issue. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say for now, unless anyone has questions.
Cool, and feel free to ask your questions to Hannah in the chat. I just put one in there, but thanks, Hannah. And we love being in Oklahoma. I think Hannah's story is specifically interesting there, just given the context that she was talking about. It's one of our newest sites. So I helped co-found the organization in 2009 in Rhode Island. The smallest state in the country, but big in stature, and we've expanded to 6 different offices around the country since then. You can see where we are with the circles, and so we are in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, New York City, where I am today, the Bay Area, Oklahoma City, and Central Texas. And then as part of a new strategic plan, we've started partnering with districts on the ground where we don't necessarily have staff people on the ground, where we don't have staff people on the ground. And so in these places, we've started doing teacher training, and so those communities which we piloted last year include San Diego, California, and Camden, New Jersey, with more to come this year. So what do we actually do? So two forms of concurrent work. One, and this is all towards the end goal of ensuring that every young person in this country receives an action civics education. It's important to know that we do not in any way, case, shape, or form think that Generation Citizen will be the only organization that can ensure that all young people receive an effective action civics education. And so because of that, we both do programming at the local level, working with schools, and then a newer part of our work is that we're advocating to ensure that states are prioritizing action civics as a vital component of the curriculum. And so really what we're doing is both offering some sort of supply and building demand at the same time. In terms of the actual work in the classroom, our core work is our democracy coach model. This is, we recruit, train, supervise college volunteer, call them democracy coaches because they are coaches that coach about democracy, and they support teachers in facilitating our curriculum. And so it's a peer-to-near-peer mentorship model where the college students are helping out throughout, and they're going in twice a week over the course of the semester to really help implement that. We also have a teacher-led model, our newer model. We work directly with teachers, offering them professional development to support their own implementation of Action Civics. And really what happens over the course of the semester is, like Hannah said, as a class during the school day, students choose very local issues that they care about, like sex ed in their schools, and then figure out how to actually make it happen. And then we also run a small number of programs we keep getting the question asked, which is relevant for an impact webinar. What happens to actually deepen student civics growth? One program is the Community Change Fellowship, the summer program for middle and high school alumni. So folks that have gone through our program and are really excited to stay engaged and involved, they receive a stipended summer internship in political advocacy or government offices. So their city council person, a local advocacy group, they receive professional development every Friday throughout the semester, the summer as well, excuse me. And last year we supported 52 fellows across Boston, New York City, and Providence. And then we also have a student leadership board, Hannah's part of, which we formed in the summer of 2016, really to ensure that we are living our values, ensuring that students are front and center in telling us how to make this better, how to make our curriculum better. So they engage in local DC training and Civics Day. We have a former SLB member speaking at a big fundraising event we have tonight, or participating in tonight in San Francisco. So they are the best spokespeople for the organization that we have. We're also going to get young people on our national board soon. So look for that in next year's Impact webinar. And then the other stream of work we have is advocating for Action Civics in states across the country. So we do so through a combination of thought leadership, coalition building, policy. Last year we co-led a statewide campaign to the House and Senate passed a comprehensive civics education bill in Massachusetts, which is on the governor's desk. We've actually been working with state agencies in North Dakota and Utah on their own civic standards, and we continue as a way to incentivize more civics education, look into lowering the voting age to 16 in local elections. We also have a full policy advocacy agenda on the website if you'd like to offer or look at more details. So quickly wanted to go through our theory of change. This whole Impact webinar is around our theory of change. Most of it is here, but you can see the entirety of it on our website. But basically, oh, there we go. It all is here. Technology is amazing. So the end goal of our theory of change is that every young person does receive an effective Action Civics education, and that ultimately our American democracy is strengthened by the universal participation of citizens from all backgrounds and communities. That notion of universal participation is really important because it influences what we see as our target population, which is students furthest from opportunity, low-income, underrepresented young people that are currently not able or participating in the system. Their voices are not heard, and it's why GC focuses specifically on that population. But this entire Impact webinar is essentially assessing how well are we assessing our theory of change. So just quickly to go into that a little bit more in terms of the purpose of the briefing, this is the 5th annual webinar, so you can mark it as an annual occurrence, where we're sharing everything that we do, efforts, highlights, challenges. To date, evaluation in GC's history is focused mainly on program feedback and organizational learning. We're starting to incorporate more of that advocacy into what we're doing. It's really important that this is not seen as a, is GC working, is GC not working? It's rather what is working and what's not working. So it's not red light, green light, but more what are the green lights and the yellow lights throughout. And so, and what do we want to try to learn next year? And so, and we try to be pretty honest about this as well. So all that said, I've talked for enough, so I'm going to hand things over to Sarah, who's going to talk about what we do and the actual tools that we use.
Thanks, Scott. So our primary program goals center around cultivation of the 3 indicators which academic experts agree best predict the likelihood of students' future civic engagement. That would be civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions. By civic knowledge, we mean students' understanding of the basic governmental processes, structures, and players. By civic skills, we mean students' ability to effectively interact with those processes and systems and people. And by civic dispositions, we're referring to motivation and other mindsets which contribute to a student's desire to actively participate in the political process. We've also started measuring students' experience actually engaging in civic action as a part of our program, as past years of evaluation have led us to believe that this engagement further fuels student learning on the indicators above. To measure these outcomes, as well as to regularly gather feedback on our program for the purposes of directing immediate support and of improving our own practice, we conduct routine classroom observations and collect surveys from students, teachers, and volunteers. This past year, we were also fortunate to learn from 2 discrete projects, both of which we'll elaborate upon later in this conversation. We're excited to discuss with you today what we've learned from this range of evaluation efforts in the past year. But before we do that, I do want to say a few words about where we've come since last year's impact report. We learned from students and others that engaging with adults from the community is memorable and valuable, so we built into our research unit the occasion for students to call and learn from local elected officials and advocacy experts. We saw variation in the roles teachers and DCs were playing in the classroom, so we enhanced our training for teachers and began testing changes in the traditional DC as lesson leader role. We also heard from folks around the country about the demand for this work, and we delved into learning how to do this better and more broadly by launching our first remote programming, as well as piloting with Encore.org how older volunteers could be beneficial in remote classrooms, and how to encourage students from different communities to be learning actively from one another. Lastly, we observed that our student surveys still have room for improvement, so we work to strengthen language on these to maximize what we're learning from students. That evolution led us into the 2017-2018 school year. This was the first year that we tried out programming in districts where we don't have staff on the ground. So we were curious to see how those partnerships, along with an expanded caseload nationwide, would go. We were gratified to see students maintaining the strong outcomes and stakeholders the high satisfaction of previous years. Our evaluation overall reminded us that our continued greatest need is to continue to hone in on ensuring that all students are engaged in the classroom and that schools have the clear curriculum to make that happen and the opportunities for assessing learning to prove that it's happening. Elena will expand on this 5th bullet point when we hand her the mic in a few minutes. But first, we'd love to break down this data in a bit more detail. We served more than 14,000 young people in 7 states across the country last year, and in partnership with hundreds of teachers and volunteers. And our students dove into launching over 500 projects to improve their schools, cities, or states. Here's a summary of who those students and partners were. We partner primarily, as Scott mentioned, with under-resourced schools, which we define as those in which more than 50% of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. I want to raise up on this slide our continuing efforts to diversify and retain our Democracy Coach cohort, both continued priorities of the organization, and to deepen our relationship with schools, tracked by us both in terms of partnership retention and in terms of school partners who make the choice to build Action Civics into an experience all students in one grade get to participate in, or whole school partnerships as we refer to them. So let me tell you what this community of students and partners brought to life over the course of the past year. Here's a word cloud of the most popular focus issues classes broached in the 2017-2018 school year. They built projects to explore and address housing, gun violence, sexual assault, immigration, and as you can see, much more. And here's what's happened in the process. Teachers reported that 76% of their students increased their civic knowledge. Given our program goals, we were pleased to see and hear that students are really expanding their understanding of the intricacies of local government through GC. what we're realizing is that students' learning here often hinges on their teachers' knowledge of and comfort leading students into navigating these local political webs. So we're now not only working to increase the clarity of this content in our curriculum, but in our teacher training as well. Teachers reported that 71% of their students developed civic skills and cited students' gains in the 3 C's, communication, critical thinking, and collaboration, as the greatest areas of change. There was a minor dip last year in students' perception of their efficacy in working with others, or I should say 2 years ago, and we were excited to see a bump in those numbers this year, which we posit might be a reflection of the evolution of the political climate from that of the election cycle 2 years ago up until what students are experiencing this year. And as all researchers will tell you, skill assessment remains a challenge for us and a goal for us to innovate around in the year ahead. And we'd be happy to expand on that in more detail too. According to teachers, 61% of their students cultivated civic dispositions or mindsets, which we heard described as students recognizing their personal power and agency, finding confidence in their voices, and paying new attention to the issues occurring around them in their communities. We were gratified that the focus of GC seems to be clear and that we're having a stronger influence on encouraging students to engage in the most active of civic activities, such as contacting public officials, rather than their likelihood of, say, volunteering in general. We also surveyed this year changes in students' interest seeking out conversations with people with different points of view, and saw a 12% increase in their interest seeking out those potentially difficult conversations, such that over 50% of students thought by the end of the semester that this was an important thing to do. Since we began to evaluate changes in students' experience with civic action on our surveys 2 years ago, we've set about doing more in our programming to ensure that students have access to these experiences. The number of students who had ever contacted or met with a public official rose from a 110% increase pre to post program 2 years ago to actually a 175% increase last year, also mirroring the rise in the number of students who had written an article or op-ed, which grew from a healthy 66% increase 2 years ago to a 135% increase over programming last year, which we consider a promising trend. Because political scientists have uniformly found that the most powerful way to engage a student in civic or political activities is to invite him or her to participate, we believe that building these experiences into students' in-class learning opportunities extends just that invitation, an invitation that students from under-resourced or low-income schools often do not receive otherwise. I know that that's a lot of numbers and bullet points, so let's round out this data by sharing another story. And to do that, let me introduce our regional program manager and a former GC teacher, Megan Brandon, to tell us about how these indicators showed up holistically in the classroom for her students and then beyond.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Megan Brandon, and I am a former social studies teacher in Bastrop, Texas, a rural community of around 8,000 people outside of Austin. In the spring of 2017, my third period Generation Citizen class came to the quick realization that there was very little for young people to do in our small town of Bastrop, especially in order for them to gain very valuable leadership skills. They chose this as their class focus issue, and through research, they determined that other towns and cities in Texas have youth boards that work with local government. My students then crafted a goal to form a youth council. They worked with the city manager and elected officials and presented their idea to the Bastrop City Council in May of 2017. The council was on board, but really wanted the students to dive deeper and outline what this could look like in our small town. The project didn't stop at the end of their GC semester that May. The students rallied over the summer. They came back in August, more passionate and more determined than ever before to make this happen. A large group of my former third period GC class met last school year after school during their free time, researching, setting up meetings with the school district, and putting together bylaws and an application template. They presented their version of the bylaws to council last December in 2017. They received unanimous approval for the formation of a youth advisory council. My students made history that day with the City of Bastrop Ordinance 2017-32, which cites the creation of this council. The Austin American-Statesman was there and documented their historic moment. The students didn't stop. The work continued into this past spring. They worked with district officials. They put in place an application process for all high school students in the district to be able to apply. And I'm very proud to say that the inaugural 12 students for Bastrop's Youth Advisory Council were sworn in this past May 22nd. It includes students from every high school in the district. 4 of my former students are on the board, and 2 were the driving force behind its existence. I know we get asked a lot in Generation Citizen, you know, what happens at the end of the semester with an Action Civics project. It's not always possible for, you know, a project to continue on. You know, students may graduate, they may transition to another campus, but I think this story really shows that students can continue to work towards their civic goal. My students learned a lot through the process. They learned how local government works, and they learned how to reach out to decision makers. I think the most important takeaway that they learned is they can make lasting change happen. And Ordinance 2017-32 proves this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that story, Megan. In addition to stories, we're always keen to collect feedback from our stakeholders themselves. In the past year, we're really glad to have seen participant satisfaction numbers not only hold steady, but slightly increase across the board, despite the growth in program size we supported last year. They also continue to help us map out our priorities moving forward, which we'll discuss further at the end of the hour. I do want to pause here for a moment before we shift gears to share about a separate strand of analysis to invite any questions that we can answer about content that's been covered thus far. Feel free to use the chat function to insert those. And as you're stewing and simmering on them, as they come up, we'll stop again as we pause at the end of the next section and might leave more time for discussion. So for now, let me actually turn it over to Elena Gustafson, who in her graduate studies at the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley last year, took on a project to analyze 11 semesters of GC students' focus issues and projects. Elena?
Hi, everyone. So I was very glad that I was able to be connected with Generation Citizen for my MPH thesis project last year. I got to take a bit of a big picture view of what are the trends over time that we're seeing in Generation Citizen data related to the focus projects that classes are choosing to engage in, and had an opportunity through this large-scale analysis to highlight what youth are saying is important to them in the Action Civics realm. So these are some of the questions that we are engaging with in this data analysis. And as far as I and my research advisors are aware, this is the first large-scale analysis of this type of any Action Civics program across the US. So this is a real opportunity for Generation Citizen to put large-scale data forward and engage with civic engagement research and make an impact in that field. You can go ahead and click ahead, Sarah. So I analyzed data from spring 2012 through fall 2017. I'm currently in the process of looking through spring 2018 data to include in this analysis as we're submitting this data to publication. We ended up with over 1,600 action projects to be able to analyze after some exclusions due to some limited or missing data. And we ended up through an iterative coding process, figuring out these 8 parent categories to code projects in. All of these have numerous subcodes. So you can see on the right what those 8 categories are and the percentage that they held in all of the data projects over all of the semesters. Safety and violence included subtopics like bullying, gang violence, sexual assault, racial profiling. Schooling projects ranged from school lunch topics to addressing dropout rates, to curricula changes and addressing student and school resources. Basic needs covered issues like homelessness, poverty, food access. Justice covered topics ranging from policing to gun policy, immigration, criminal justice. Health was substance abuse, mental health, teen pregnancy, environment, issues related to pollution, conservation, water management, and parks. College, career, and enrichment, discussing youth and community employment, as well as issues like college funding and career prep. And then lastly, transportation, covering issues from school transit to public transit and infrastructure, as well as car safety. So that's just a quick overview of the range that we saw and how they made up the total. You can go ahead, Sarah. So we analyzed these topics by some big trends. First one was age. You can see in this chart the middle school versus high school total for some of these different topics. In middle school, we saw, for instance, more safety and violence topics, and this was largely driven by a higher rate of bullying projects addressed in middle school. Whereas at the high school, the orange line, we saw a slightly higher rate of justice projects, as well as a focus on college, career, and enrichment topics. This makes sense given what we know middle school versus high schoolers are addressing. We also saw that middle school tended to address broader projects. So some of the topics that they did related to homelessness more broadly, or food access and police brutality, whereas high school classes focused on projects with a little bit more specificity and systems orientation. So they would name projects like homeless services, food system and food deserts, or criminal justice laws. So we saw a little bit of that shift, which makes sense with youth development theory and stage salient growth processes that we see with youth. The next thing that we analyzed trends with was by region. So these charts show a lot of information, but wanted to highlight some of what the changes we saw across the region. So for instance, in Rhode Island, this first one that is highlighted, you'll see that they have a high number of safety and violence, that SV blue color on the bottom, as well as a high number of schooling topics. In Rhode Island, this was driven largely by a high focus on gang topics related to the safety and violence parent code. In New York, we see a slightly higher rate of justice-related projects, that dark blue in the middle. This is related to a high number of projects related to stop and frisk and police brutality. You can also see, comparing these, each location has a different number of projects that were analyzed. So that's why overall, those numbers that we saw at the beginning are the overall total, and each of these regions will be a little bit different for the percentages of their parent codes. The next state, Massachusetts, you can see has a fairly high number of health topics, that white color close to the top. This is largely driven by a high number of substance abuse topics, specifically related to opioids. The Bay Area next has a high number of basic needs topics, that darker gray in the middle. Bay Area had a high number of projects related to housing. And then you can see for the next ones, Oklahoma, they have a much smaller number of total projects, which is why the totals that they have didn't skew the overall total percentages as much. But Oklahoma had a high number of schooling projects, and a lot of this was related to a focus on school funding issues. And then finally, Texas, you can see has a high number of justice-related projects, and this was largely driven by focus on immigration topics. And then the last thing that we did a big analysis by was over time. So with this, we see a couple of key trends in what youth are focusing on. We see them following some trends related to federal and national issues. So for instance, big spike in topics related to police brutality following the growth of Black Lives Matter and related to the timing of several different non-indictments across the country. We also see spikes related to topics on immigration, as well as discrimination and hate crimes following the 2016 election, as we know that there are spikes in those issues across the country. So you can see in the chart below that justice topics trended upwards over time with a couple of key spikes. Both of those, the first spike is driven by police brutality topics, and the second spike is driven by some immigration ones. We also see some trends upwards related to basic needs, and this follows along with some epidemiological trends that we see across the country, as we know that housing and homelessness is growing as a huge issue, and that is a big part of the basic needs topics that we're seeing as that category is growing. The other epidemiological trends we're seeing are related to substance abuse within the health category. We're seeing some really interesting trends related to youth addressing topics like opioids. I think a particular note is that youth are recognizing this as an issue in their focus projects and in their that they're doing through Generation Citizen before opioids became a local media issue. So for instance, in Massachusetts, we see classes starting to focus on opioids in fall 2016, after an increase in some regional overdose deaths, but before there was a large growth in media and public attention in the topic in spring 2017. Similarly, we're seeing a recent trend from this past fall, and as a preview for the spring data I'm analyzing, we're seeing an increase in topics related to vaping and juuling, so these e-cigarettes that are popping up in classes. This is really interesting, I think, especially because of the focus on juuling this past spring. Though over the summer, the FDA just gave the company Juul a period of 6 months to prove that they aren't targeting to youth with their messaging. So youth are recognizing that this is an issue right ahead of when the media is picking this up as an issue. As those of us who work with youth know, students are aware of what the issues are that are going on in their schools. The other kind of topics that we see by trend over time are related to adolescent health issues. We're seeing kind of a decrease since the start of the data in teen pregnancy topics, and a bit of an increase in things related to substance abuse, which we know parallels the trends we're seeing in adolescent health over this same period of time. And then we're also seeing a lot of focus on local timely topics. So for instance, Oklahoma had a high proportion of topics related to school funding issues. This was in the semester before the teacher strikes and media attention, but we know that that is a very local and timely a topic. And we see that in other areas with some spikes in topics related to some passage of local laws or some kind of time-limited local issues. So overall, some takeaways from this. We know that Generation Citizen, as Sarah mentioned earlier, works with youth in low-income schools. And though we couldn't do any specific analysis by race or socioeconomic status for trends related to project focus, we do know that schools partnering with Generation Citizen serve youth in what researchers call the civic engagement gap. So youth who typically are not given as many experiences with civics education and opportunities. So that's just to highlight that we know that these opportunities are important, and it is important to hear what youth who are not given civic engagement opportunities necessarily in other settings are saying about what's important to them. Because Generation Citizen, you can say, pull up the next point, allows youth to choose topics within their classroom that is of relevance to them, this allows for topics that really align with their lived experiences and backgrounds. And this brings youth's insider expertise to these community issues. This is important just for thinking about using this data as evidence, because we know that this insider expertise can strengthen the rigor and relevance and the reach of their projects and their identified solutions. I analyzed the data based off of alignment with trauma and equity focus for the projects. And we saw a high number of projects addressing traumatic topics either inherently or directly. So allowing for a space for positive adaptation to turn these traumatic issues into action can be a really powerful thing for students. As well, you can pull up the next point, we see that youth had a high focus on topics that were addressing equity issues. And this shows that youth have a high level of critical consciousness about what is going on in their community and are really able to think about these issues with a critical eye. Again, things that all of those of us who work with youth already maybe know inherently, but it's really powerful to have this large scale data for Generation Citizen to be able to show this in their projects. So what the next steps for this work is, we're currently in submission for publication, and we're hoping that this process of publication and democratizing evidence by lifting up youth voices and saying where are the topics that are important to youth across the country will really allow Generation Citizen to contribute to civic engagement research as well as theory development and outcome measurements. And I think the field is only set to benefit from research that elevates youth voice and the choices that they are making. So I'm very thankful that I was able to partner with Generation Citizen on this project.
Thank you so much, Elena. We're so grateful for the partnership as well, and for the great research that we look forward to building on and learning from and acting on in the months ahead. So I just want to invite again, if you have any questions about Elena's research, feel free to offer those in the chat section, and we'll either be responding within that window or we'll be making time at the end of the conversation to address your question. In addition to learning from Elena's research, we also learned this year from a low-touch survey that we sent to student alumni. Our goal here was not to assemble scientifically valid evidence of long-term student outcomes. Rather, we aim to check on how well our assumptions about the long-term impact of programming generally align with what students would report, so that as we look to longitudinal studies in the future, we're able to focus those surveys with intention. We also polled students on the best ways to get in touch with them in the future. Shockingly for us old folks, Facebook was at the very bottom of the list, with email and text topping out the list of preferred contact methods. And we were gratified by what some students shared they remembered from the program, chiefly the Advocacy Hourglass, which we introduced at the beginning of the hour, interactions with adults and other decision makers, either in the classroom or at Civics Day, and the process of collaborating with their class, doing community outreach, and then enjoying taking part in this hands-on project. So we're excited to build on this learning in a deep way in the future. And speaking of the future, we also have grand plans for the year ahead. So we're happily already checking off our goals to hire a full-time measurement and evaluation champion who will be starting with us in the office in 2 weeks. And we've already built out a teacher leadership board, which we launched last summer. We have, however, mapped out a host of other projects to dive into over the course of the 2018-19 school year, including completing a curriculum differentiation project, institutionalizing learning from rural partners and from other program pilots, and making strides in how we approach equity within our classrooms, within our program, and within our organization. Thank you all so much for your time and attention this afternoon. We, again, would love to hear any questions you have. Feel free to drop them into the chat box at any time, and we'll direct them to the appropriate party. And if you have no questions, we appreciate you joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.